When I was a sophomore in college, I had one of my most life-changing violin lessons where I was introduced to the concept of happy practicing. I had a recital coming up in just a few weeks, and I was performing Brooks' Scottish Fantasy. And it was a huge reach for me technically and musically. I was 1 week away from my pre-recital, and I literally could not play the fourth movement. In my lesson with my wonderful teacher, Robert Waters, he was asking about how my practicing was going because I was expressing frustration. He asked me how I responded to challenging moments in the practice room, and I told him that there was a lot of foot stomping, hair pulling, weeping, wailing, gnashing of teeth, the whole 9 yards. He gently expressed to me that this approach probably wasn't getting me anywhere, and introduced me to a new approach which he calls happy practicing. For the rest of the lesson, we practiced this new approach. He would have me select a difficult passage of music, then envision what it would feel like and sound like to play the passage exactly how I wanted to. I would play it, and Robert would ask me, what was different between what you envisioned and what you played? Once we had a proper diagnosis of what was still missing from my performance, we could properly design practice interventions to shore up sections that were still not working the way I wanted them to. And if you're wondering, I was in fact able to play the piece for my sophomore recital. That's what this picture is from. Next slide, please. All right, so how many of your students enjoy practicing? Oh, man, I was hoping to see like maybe a few more hands than that, but that makes sense. How many of you enjoy practicing? Oh, phew. Okay, good. More hands. That's great. That's great. So for those of you who don't enjoy practicing, you're actually in good company. A lot of people don't like practicing, including some wonderful professionals that I've spoken with. Practicing is sadly an absolute necessity for building any skill. So I'm not here to give you some silver bullet for how to be able to avoid practicing. I hope that instead we can talk about ways to make practice spaces more nurturing and productive environments for you and your students, so that you can enjoy the many hours a day that you'll spend practicing. I love practicing now, but I didn't always, and part of learning to love practicing was figuring out what is practice and demystifying the concept of like what I actually do in practice. Next slide, please. So part of why I asked if you enjoy practicing is because I think modeling practice as a desirable activity is really important for our students. So this presentation is a blend of giving you tools that you can pass on to your students, but also giving you tools that you can use in your practice room to hopefully make practicing a more enjoyable process. So, because if we're talking about practicing as a grind or a chore to our students, then they're going to absorb that mentality towards practicing and feel that way about their own practice. My teacher in my master's degree is a self-proclaimed practice nerd. Like, she loves practicing, and she talks about how much she loves practicing. And I think that had a real impact on me and my relationship with practicing, to see that she loved it so much, so by extension, I could love it so much. And the way that we practice can be a resource for our students in showing them how to practice. So feel free to share. That might be the next slide. I can't remember. So I have a lot more experience as a student than I do as a teacher. I've spent a lot of time learning about how to make practice more successful for myself, but I know that there's a wealth of experience in this room in terms of teaching and how to help students be most successful. So if you have questions or examples at any point on any of these principles, please share. I'd love to hear from you. Next slide. So then, what is happy practicing? So we'll talk more about this, but as paradoxical as it sounds, happy practicing is about systematically removing emotion from certain parts of our process. And it's about objectively examining and responding to what we are actually doing. So we'll talk more about that, but that's the idea, is that happy practicing is actually about removing emotion from certain parts of practicing. All right, next question is, what is practice? I feel like my husband is having flashbacks to our music history days. We had a teacher who was always asking very philosophical questions like this, like, what is practice? So I think it is really important, though, to identify what practicing is and what it encompasses. So I've made a little diagram for you all, and this diagram is going to break down practice for any skill that you're trying to learn. This is what practicing is. So we know what we want, we know what we did, and then we have to address what is in the gap between those two things. So most of what we call practice is that arrow. It's the stuff that happens in between. But if we don't know what we want, if we don't have a clear vision of what we're actually aiming towards, it can make practice really frustrating and less productive. So next slide. My formula for practice features 3 steps, which is vision, diagnosis, and intervention. We'll dive into each of these stages of practice to understand how each one relates to cultivating happy practice. Next slide. Oh, sorry, go back to the other slide. I thought I put a slide in for this. I didn't. Practicing is a brain-led activity. So our brain directs what our body should do, but so often practice can become a rote body-led activity instead, which can end up being unproductive and really frustrating for your students if they're just sort of mindlessly pounding or sawing away, but not having a clear idea of what they're working towards. So I'm sort of laughing to myself that like this, my formula and my 3 steps for practice seem like a very intellectual approach to practicing, but that's because I've found that the more that we can mindfully put our brains in charge of practicing rather than letting our bodies sort of go on autopilot and take over, the more focused and efficient and honestly nurturing our practice can be. So, because as musicians, we have to be able to create an artistic vision for ourselves, and then we have to be able to identify the ways that we're not yet meeting that vision and the steps that we need to take to get there. The thing is that the language we use for setting the vision and for identifying what's not working about the vision are different. So, okay, now we can go to the next slide. Step 1 is vision. So what are you aiming towards? When we see a word like vision, at least I get lofty imaginings in my head about deep, meaningful interpretations of the piece that will leave the audience in tears. And that can be what vision is. But what I mean in this situation, I mean any goal that we have for any amount of music that we are going to practice. So your vision could be to play 4 notes in tune. It could be to play a line of music with the proper bowing or the proper fingering. The amount of elements that you can incorporate into your vision will depend on ability and experience, but it will also depend on things like how much sleep you got last night or whether you've had a snack recently. So go to the next slide. I can't remember if I made... Yeah, so these are some questions for vision setting to guide your work in this stage. So how do you choose an appropriate amount of music to envision? Again, this will depend on where you are in the process of learning a piece or how many difficulties there are to encounter within your chosen passage. Particularly when you're starting with this more mindful approach, or if your students are starting with this more mindful approach to practicing, I would recommend very small and digestible passages. I would also recommend incorporating this kind of vision setting and listening in something like a scale, which I don't know why I'm pretending I play piano. This is scales for me. Something like a scale which you already have the motor capacity for, and so you don't need to think too much about what your hands are doing, so instead you can start practicing this idea of setting a vision for what you want your scale to sound like. So there's one little kind of tangible piece of advice, is that when you're practicing this practice approach, start with something small that your students already know how to do with their bodies. Okay, so what does this vision setting, how do you choose an appropriate vision? So again, this also depends on where you are in the process of learning a piece, and it also depends on what particular skills you are really focusing on at that moment. For example, I try to have a portion of my practice every day where solid intonation is my vision for a passage, because I know that's something that I just need to constantly check in with. recently I've been trying to play with a flatter bow hair more consistently, so like that is something that I include as a vision in passages of music right now because it's a skill that I'm particularly trying to work on. So especially if you have particular skills that you know your students are trying to reinforce and build, you can encourage them to set that as their vision for small passages of music. Okay. What does this vision setting look like in reality? So this is some of the concrete stuff. This is what's really exciting about this presentation. So when we're trying to reinforce new practice habits, we have to be really mindful of what we're doing so that we don't slip back into old familiar ways of doing things. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why that is the case based on neuroscience. So eventually some of these things may become second nature for you, but as you're embarking on your journey with happy practicing, these are some concrete things I would try. I think these are on the next slide. Yeah, okay. So number one is to speak your goal out loud. I am super big on this technique. Before you play through your chosen section, say out loud what you are aiming to accomplish with this repetition. So you can say, I'm going to play this passage with an F natural that is high enough. I'm going to play this passage with the proper pedaling. I'm going to play this passage and relax before I go to the high note. This method has two benefits. One, it forces you, forces is a bad word. It requires you to solidify what your vision is before you start. And then two, it also has you positively manifesting that you're going to play it the way you want to. So especially when I'm feeling like particularly unfocused on a day, like if you walk past my practice room, you'll hear me like speaking out loud to myself because it's just a really good way to keep yourself focused and to make sure that you do have that clear vision before you continue. Okay, singing the passage. How many of you have had a teacher who made you sing a passage in a lesson? Yeah. For those of us who aren't singers, like somehow this brings up every insecurity we have as musicians, but your teacher isn't just trying to torture you. And maybe some of you do this to your students, and that's great. Keep it up. Because singing a passage out loud, again, it's just another method that requires you to solidify what your vision is in terms of phrasing and sound quality. So this is just another way of coming at the same thing, of solidifying that vision before you or your student plays through a passage. The last one is to visualize the way you want the passage to feel and sound. So this is the technique that I mentioned in my story at the beginning, and it works in combination with the other techniques we've talked about. How many of you have learned about mental practice? Okay, cool. Not maybe as many hands as I would have thought. We could do a whole presentation on mental practice. It's a really fascinating topic. That's essentially what I'm talking about here. It's all the rage, mental practices, for good reason. Because what you're doing in mental practice is you're clearly visualizing what it feels like to play your instrument and to have it sound the way you want it to. And actually, being able to clearly visualize the feeling of playing a passage, even without your instrument, causes the same neural pathways in your brain to fire as if you were actually playing your instrument, which is crazy. So next time your student tries to give you an excuse about why they couldn't practice because they were on vacation or something, you can say, let's talk about mental practice, because you can do that anywhere. This kind of practice, though, does take a lot of practice. Mental practice takes practice. The more you practice setting a vision for yourself and being able to take stock of what you can physically execute and then internalizing the sensation of what it is to play your instrument, the stronger your mental practice will be. Yeah, like I said, we could spend a whole presentation on mental practice, but this is the idea of mental practice, is visualizing what you want it to feel like and sound like. Do any of you have additional ideas for how to set a vision for yourself when you're practicing a passage? Yeah.
Some people object to this, but I think it's really useful to listen to models. You know, what does a professional tone sound like? What does a professional, not that you have to copy every detail of an artist's interpretation, but for students especially, they haven't necessarily heard a whole lot of professional in playing and might not really understand what the characteristic sound of the piece or the instrument plays.
Yeah, that's great, and that is giving them a bigger library of sounds that they can envision for themselves. When I was in my undergrad, that same wonderful teacher had a lesson, actually on Scottish fantasy again, had a lesson where he said, I want you to take the beginning of the third movement and I want you to find 5 different recordings and I want you to try to imitate them exactly. And the point wasn't that I needed to play like Oistrakh or like Arthur Grumio, but the idea was that I needed to be able to have a vision for myself and have a model that I could then aim towards and figure out how do I get from where I am to what they sound like. So.
They're definitely worse things than playing like Oistrakh.
Oh yeah, and if I could play like Oistrakh, I would. I just like to have reasonable goals for myself. So I think I saw another hand. Yeah.
I read a book a long time ago called The Practice Revolution. I don't remember the author, but he talked about tips of gamifying practice, and it was more about, for children, you pick a specific measure or 2 measures, and then you make a game out of, we want to get here, and then it's kind of like a battle against your imaginary person to see if you did it or you didn't do it. If you do it, then you can move on or add a new level, a new layer of difficulty to it. And I really like a lot of the tips that he make it. When it's a game, it doesn't feel as, it takes some of the bad emotion out of it, I think.
Exactly. We talk a lot about how children learn through play, and here's the thing. Adults are not any different. Like, adults also learn through play, and so practicing becomes so much more successful when you can reframe it as a game or a puzzle or a fun challenge. And that the way that you do that will depend on the student and the age of the student. But yeah, if you gamify something, you have objectives in games, right? Like, you have an objective, and that's going to be your vision. So finding a way to do that with your student and then to give them an approach to move forward is wonderful. Yeah, gamifying things is awesome. Great teaching tool. Not just for your young students, but for yourself as an adult, too. Yeah, exactly. Classic. Okay, if you can move to the next slide, Jess. So for teachers, let's talk for a little bit about how do you teach or encourage this kind of vision setting for students. For me, it's just helpful to know that there's a lot that you're already doing that is helping students with this vision setting. It's just that, like, maybe you call it something different or it's not identified that way in your head. So particularly with beginning students, you're going to be feeding them a vision for a long time. So you're going to be saying things like, I want you to play this with a straight bow, or I want you to play this with a half note that's long enough. I want you to play with your first finger low enough. And part of the challenge of creating self-sufficient practicers is moving them from us feeding them the vision to helping them know how to generate a vision for their own practicing. And I think this can start really early in the learning process by starting to turn questions back towards your students. So you can ask them, what do you want to improve on your next repetition of this section? What doesn't feel comfortable to you yet? Like, what do you want to get feeling more comfortable? Other thoughts from you all about how to encourage this kind of vision setting for your students? Yeah.
Well, I guess just a comment about not giving up. Kind of like the birds and the bees thought. It's not just one time,
Yeah.
not just one level and you're done. It's going to be repetitive. They're not going to internalize it on the first introduction.
Yes, great. Thank you for that reminder. And so much of what I'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation is about practice as a process. Students need to understand that, and we as teachers need to understand that not only are our students progressing in how they're learning pieces, they're progressing in their knowledge of how to engage in the process of practicing. So thank you for that reminder. Okay, next slide. And we're moving on to step 2, which is diagnosis. And the big question for step 2 is, what is in the gap? I skipped step 1A, which is where you'll actually play the passage that you've chosen and that you've set your vision for. So once you've done that, it's time to ask yourself the all-important practice question, which is, what is the difference between what I envisioned and what I played? So going back to that diagram from earlier with the arrow in between. Okay, next slide. So tips for diagnosing in practice in a way that will allow practicing to be happy. Objective focus. This is like one of the biggest things I want you to take away from this presentation. This is the stage where we want to be really objective, and where more often than not, your students have probably already learned to be self-deprecating and hard on themselves, rather than being able to objectively take stock of what has happened. So one of the tools for having this objective focus is to remove I statements. So this is the step, again, when we're going to take emotion out of practicing completely. And this skill takes a lot of practice. So pay attention to the language that you're using when you diagnose your playing. So statements like, I am so out of tune, I never count this right, I hate the way that sounded, are not helpful in the practice room for multiple reasons. One, they don't actually give you a clear diagnosis of what happened. To say I'm always out of tune doesn't actually tell you if the note was sharp or flat. And saying I never count this right doesn't tell you what bar you're miscounting. And saying I hate the way that sounded literally doesn't tell you anything. Second, making statements that attach our shortcomings to our identity or self-worth mean that every failing we make as a musician is a moral failing. And that is a lot harder to recover from than just moving your finger one direction or the other. So I have a small activity, so let's go to the next slide. I want you all to help me make these I statements into objective diagnostic statements. So they're open for interpretation. There's not like one right answer for each of these, because you can imagine for yourself like what is going wrong for the student in these passages. So if a student says something like, I always play so out of tune, what is something that would be more objective and more productive for them to say instead about the passage they just played? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and can you be more, let's see if we can even be more specific with the diagnosis. Yeah, the G was too low. I played a G, or that is an I statement. I know, it's tricky, right? That note was a G instead of a G sharp. Yeah. I think I saw another hand.
Maybe with two fingers playing shallow, or...
Yeah. The second finger was too low. Yeah.
Well, you have to actually have them start thinking, is there something that's consistently happening?
Mm-hmm.
So is it your finger all the time?
Mm-hmm.
So are you doing a cross like this, or is your hand like this?
Mm-hmm.
That?
Mm-hmm.
Or, what is the problem?
Yes.
What are the symptoms of your third finger?
Yeah, exactly. That's great. Okay, so next one. My rhythm is so bad. What would be a more objective diagnostic statement for that?
This rhythm is tricky.
Uh-huh. That's great. So giving themselves space to not know it yet, but to give them space that they will get it. Yeah, so maybe they're able to identify that the triplets in this bar are rushing, or this half note wasn't quite long enough. We'll talk a little bit more about the reality of diagnosing in just a little bit. But yes.
I've noticed that with these I statements, with myself and with my students, that usually it's a belief that they have, and that's why they're using I. They've come to believe that about themselves. So, like with rhythm, they will say, I don't do a good job with rhythm. There's, or like I have a hard time with rhythm, or and so what that ends up being is sort of like this major block, and so that's almost like their brain cannot, has a hard time busting through this sort of cloudy haze to even think. Because it's really simple math most of the time, but it's like they can't quite do it.
Yeah.
Because it's this belief about what they're keeping themselves in a box. So I think it's really important to remove the I statements, but I think it'll take time to work through that, especially if this is an internal belief about themselves. They have to learn how to not believe that anymore and believe that they can count.
Yes.
That their brain can function and do the math and see clearly. But yeah, taking those eyes out.
Yeah, and, oh, yes.
I like to have my kids evaluate, well, how was that clean? You know, that time through, that repetition.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Yeah.
So they can sit there and go, well, my second fingers were high.
Mm-hmm.
Well, oh, I didn't play that, you know, that was, you know, like, so they're just sitting there and they evaluate that particular time through
Mm-hmm.
rather than sitting there saying that this is just something that I do all the time.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and then, you know, try it again, see if that can be corrected. And
Yes.
hopefully, if they are aware of what it was, then they can correct what they did.
So that's the diagnosis step that you're already engaging in with your students. And I think you're totally onto something, which is that the diagnosis stage is most helpful if you restrict it to like the passage of music that you just played, right? Like we're not making sweeping claims about your character or like you as a player in general. We're talking about what you just did objectively. Yeah.
Yeah, going along with what Jessica was saying, so much about practicing and happy practicing is taking responsibility for what happened, right? This is what happened, this is what I want, what do I need to do to get what I want, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we say I statements, I'm so bad at rhythm, I'm whatever, it gives us this false sense of responsibility. Like, I admitted to myself, yes, I'm responsible for this, but that's the toxic counterfeit of taking responsibility. To take responsibility is acknowledge that we are malleable, flexible humans,
Mm-hmm.
that this is where we are now, but this is not who we are permanently. Like, so there's also really easy for, like, those who engage the most, I have found in negative I am statements, are those who want to be as responsible as possible, but they're falling into like this faux counterfeit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Carol Dweck is a research educator, and one of the phrases that she uses is the power of yet.
Yes. That's literally in my presentation. So happy. Yes. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
Just to focus on not an overall statement. All of these say always or I can't ever, those static terms. But the power of yet says I'm not there yet, but I can be.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for previewing that because we're going to talk about that. You get the idea. This skill takes practice, and it takes a lot of mindfulness, honestly. Like, even for me, as I was putting this presentation together, I was like, oh, no, I still want to, like, make them into I statements. And I think it's a really good exercise to, like, require yourself not to while you're practicing this skill. So, next slide. So, some of you already talked about this, but once you've made your objective diagnostic statement, the next step is to ask why. So, if you said, oh, I played a G instead of a G sharp, the next step is to ask why, and then you can determine, I just didn't put my finger high enough, whatever. So once you're able to identify that, your intervention step is going to be a lot more easier and more effective. This is a couple slides back, but increasing your listening capability is also one of the goals of this diagnostic step of practice. So your students are not immediately going to be able to diagnose what's going wrong in every passage that they practice, and that's part of our role as teachers, is to help point out those things that they're not able to hear yet so that they can then go into their practice room and listen for similar situations on their own. So just another way that practicing is a process and that you can reinforce that for your students is that it's okay if they can't hear everything yet. Like, that's part of your job as a teacher, is to help them to increase their ability to listen. Next slide. We've heard some great thoughts from you all about helping students with the diagnosis step. Just a couple more thoughts from me on this. So once you've asked a student to come up with a vision for their chosen passage and they've played it, my favorite question to ask is, tell me what went well and what you want to keep practicing. I like leading with what went well because it gives students space to actually acknowledge when they've met their vision and to acknowledge what was successful in their playing. And then, by allowing students to tell you what they want to keep practicing, it allows you to assess what they are able to hear. Because sometimes you'll be like, what do you want to keep practicing? And they'll give you something like way off in left field, and you're like, oh, that was not what I was thinking we were focusing on. But okay, that's good to know that that's what you're sort of listening to and focusing on right now. So it's great as an assessment tool for you as a teacher, and it gives students a chance to diagnose aspects of their vision that they did not meet or that they want to keep working towards. Other questions to ask, You'll notice that a lot of this is about questions and about turning questions back towards your students. Questions are an amazing teaching tool. So other questions to ask are, how well did you accomplish your vision? What was different between what you envisioned and what you played? So going back to that practice question. And then when students are able to articulate something that didn't go well, you can push their self-diagnosing further by asking, okay, and why did that happen? And like I said, they won't always be able to tell you why, and you might need to guide them, but getting them thinking in that direction is really helpful. Okay, so to review the diagnosis step, this is the step where we ask what's in the gap, and this is the step where we keep it really, really objective. Okay, next step is step 3, intervention with experimentation. So now that we know what we want and we know what isn't working, we can fix it. So this is why taking the time to do those first 2 steps is so empowering to me, because it takes things from being this huge impossible mess to being a series of small manageable adjustments that we can make. I once heard Peter Slowik, who's a fabulous viola professor at Oberlin, say that if you can't play a passage, there's only 3 possible options. So 1, you'll never be able to do it, and the number of things in this category is way smaller than you would think. This is something like playing fingered 12ths on a viola. Like, that, physically, you're not going to be able to do that, or at least I'm not going to be able to. 2, you're just not practicing it in the right way, or 3, you just haven't practiced it for long enough. So that was a really empowering thing for me to learn, like, early on in college, is just like that power of yet. Like, if I can't do it yet, it's either that I need to adjust how I'm practicing, or that I'm practicing it well, but I just haven't reinforced it for long enough. So, intervention is my fancy way of saying, now we fix the thing that we know is wrong. Intervention, you could just switch it out for fixing. This is the fixing stage. So if we diagnose that our F natural was too low, this time we're going to aim to put our finger down slightly higher. If we diagnose the bar where we were miscounting the rhythm, we're going to put the instrument down to count it or conduct it to get the rhythm sorted out in our brains. And if we diagnose that our sound lost focus because our contact point wandered, then we're going to adjust our elbow angle to make a proper sounding point. I'm making this sound much more straightforward than it actually is, because here's the thing. We don't always know what the proper diagnosis is, and students don't always know what exactly is going wrong. And sometimes we need to experiment and tinker with things to actually find the proper diagnosis. Next slide. I'm really passionate about the topic of the practice room as a laboratory. So this is a space to experiment and to try new solutions. If you take nothing else from this session, take this. Every time you repeat a section, try something different. Jenny Ross, the principal second violin for the Grand Teton Music Festival, said, "You can't change anything if you don't change anything." It's also really important for you and for students not to feel stifled by feeling like you have to have exactly the right intervention for exactly the right diagnosis on your first try in the practice room. Part of turning your practice room into a happy space is about reframing it as a puzzle or a game. So saying, you know, like, oh, that fingering didn't quite fix my issue, but what if I tinker with something else? What if I try slowing my brain down before I go to that big leap, or whatever. So the more that you can encourage that kind of experimentation in your students and in their practicing, the more self-sufficient that they'll be as practicers. So next slide. So yeah, like I said, encouraging experimentation is really important in supporting students in this intervention step. So in lessons, when you diagnose issues and ask them why they are happening, then let your students brainstorm possible solutions. So you've identified that you're rushing in this bar, or that the fingering is wrong. Then flip it back to them and say, okay, and what are we going to do to fix that? Because that will start to encourage them to come up with their own interventions and to come up with different possible options. I also think it's really important to encourage students to go too far in one direction in the lesson so that they can see how much room they have to make changes. My teacher in my undergrad was really clear with me about, he would just be very frank about telling me, like, yeah, that didn't really sound any different than the last time you played it. which was important because physically it felt like I was doing a lot, but it wasn't coming across sonically, and I needed to know that. I needed to know that there was more I could do to sort of push the boundaries of my sound. So yeah, let your students make some ugly sounds sometimes in lessons so that they understand, oh, I have to go pretty far before I've gone too far in one direction or the other. Okay, so we've talked about these 3 steps. In practice, you're going to be going through this 3-step process of vision, diagnosis, and intervention really quickly a lot of times for the same passage. So I feel like the way I've outlined the 3 steps of practicing, can you go to the next slide, makes it look like it's this, like this neat thing of like, and then we spend 10 minutes on vision, and we spend 10 minutes on diagnosis, and 10 minutes on intervention, and then all of our problems are fixed, and that's not how it happens. The way that it happens in reality is a little bit more like this next slide. I made this diagram. I'm very proud of it. I think I'll probably submit it to the Museum of Modern Art. But so what this looks like is that we're going through that process in little circles over and over again. There are spots where we actually end up going backwards because we're experimenting and trying to find new solutions. There are parts where we get caught up in a particularly gnarly passage and sort of feel like we're circling back on ourselves. But in general, we have an upward trend as we're engaging with this process over and over very quickly. So we're going in an upward trend, and you're learning things all along in this process. Like, you're learning things about how to diagnose in each little step of this circle. So the nature of progress, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, let's move into a brief tangent. We're going to talk briefly about neuroscience for just a minute. We're going to talk about myelin and the power of mindful repetition. How many of you know what myelin is? Cool. Oh, there's some people that don't. That makes me so excited because I get to talk about myelin with new people. This is great. So myelin is, if you can go to the next slide, myelin is a substance that wraps around neural pathways in our brains, forming what is called a myelinated sheath. So here we have a diagram of a neuron. So we've got the 2 ends of the neuron, which I don't remember what they're called, and they're right there, but I can't think clearly. So the little purple things that look like they're wrapped around the neural pathway, those are the myelinated sheaths. And what myelinated sheaths allow the neural pathway to do is to fire faster because it's crazy. Like, the chemistry behind it is crazy. But you'll notice that there's less sort of open, exposed yellow bits in that neural pathway, which means that the electricity in that neural pathway only has to travel through the yellow. So if you have it wrapped in a myelinated sheath, then it's like a superhighway for your neural pathways. So pretty crazy. So when we take an action by firing an electrical current from one neuron to another, the brain activates myelin to wrap around that neural pathway that we just fired. And like I said, myelin around the neural pathway allows it to fire more quickly. So when we take an action, our brain makes it easier to repeat that action that we took. This can serve us well or not well in our practicing. Since our brain makes it easier to repeat actions that we repeatedly take, we need to be mindful about making sure that we're practicing and playing in ways that reinforce the neural pathways that we want. Next diagram. Okay, I borrowed this analogy from Dr. Molly Gebrian, who's a wonderful viola professor. Wow, violas are really repping in this presentation. I love that. A wonderful viola professor at the University of Arizona. So the way she describes it is that imagine that you are standing in front of a snowy field, and there are 2 options of houses that you can go to. You can go to your best friend's house. There's a crazy party going on there. It's going to be so much fun. Or you can go to, I don't know, one time she was giving this presentation, and she was like, what's a bad thing that can be in this other house? And the kid was like, stinky socks. So I just call it the stinky sock house. So you can either go to the party house or the stinky sock house. The thing is, you can't see well enough to see which direction you need to go to get to the house. And there's a snowy field. So you just pick one direction and you walk that direction, and oh, good job, you made it to the happy house. But then you come back to that spot again, and it snowed over again. So you have an equal chance of picking the good house or the stinky sock house. So the idea is that if you walk in the snow enough times, you're going to start to see a footprint path of boot prints in the snow, so that when you go back to that point, if you've walked that path a lot of times, it's going to be easier to see which direction you need to go. So if you've reinforced going to the stinky sock house a bunch of times, then when you come back there, you're going to be like, oh, well, this looks like the well-worn path, so I guess I'll go to, down this path, but that goes to the stinky sock house. So my 11-year-old brother, this cracks him up when he's practicing, and I'm like, Jed, that was a stinky sock house that you just went to, because, he is practicing in a way that reinforces, he goes to the wrong note, he hits the wrong note, and I say, that was a stinky sock house, Jed. So this is scientific evidence that you can use for your students about why you're picky with them about playing multiple repetitions well in a row, is because you're wanting them to reinforce those myelinated pathways in the way that you want them to be playing. So myelinated pathways actually stay reinforced, except in the case of degenerative diseases like MS or Alzheimer's. And what that means is that if you have a pathway that has been reinforced that you don't want to use, the only way to make a new habit is to myelinate another neural pathway. You can't actually undo the myelination of one neural pathway. So the good news about that is that you can learn any skill you want with enough mindful practice and reinforcement of the right neural pathways. And the cautionary tale is that it might feel really hard to break neural pathways that you've been reinforcing for years, but you can do it. So take care to learn skills well the first time, but also you can do it. You can forge new neural pathways. This just gives you validation for why it feels so hard to create new habits sometimes. So, okay, myelin is great. Myelin is awesome. I probably could have given a whole presentation about it, but we're going to move on from that. We're going to talk about making our practice rooms safe spaces. So next time you're in the practice room, next time you are in the practice room, pay attention to the way that you talk to yourself while practicing. And I mean the self-directed thoughts that you have, because most of the time we don't actually speak them out loud, and I think if we did, we would realize how destructive our self-talk can be. So if you had a friend who was constantly telling you, you sound terrible, you're really bad at this, I hope you would stop spending time with that friend. But sometimes we are that friend for ourselves. So if you don't like practicing, or if your students don't like practicing, consider that it might be because their practice rooms, aka their own minds, are not currently safe spaces for them. So let's talk a little bit about tools that we have for changing that and for increasing positive self-talk. So next slide. Oh, that's what I just talked about, is the thought inventory. So the first thing, again, this is kind of like, you can use the vision diagnosis intervention step in learning how to practice positive self-talk. Okay, so yes, the first bullet point on there is that this is a form of practice. So you can use this practice formula that we've been talking about to address ways that your self-talk is not benefiting you right now, and then to come up with interventions for how to address that. So we've already talked about removing I statements in the diagnosis stage of practicing, and I think that really does go a long way. These are some other tools we can use for making our practice rooms safe spaces. So reframing. Positive self-talk doesn't require that we ignore things in our playing or practicing that aren't yet what we want them to be. I think sometimes that can be a notion that being positive to ourselves requires that we sweep under the rug the things that we want to improve. But I'm really passionate in my belief that we can be both nurturing and productive as we practice. So process-oriented language is that power of yet. So just adding that one word to statements goes a long way in giving yourself space to know that this is your goal and you aren't there yet, but there is space for you to make it there. It's great because rather than just subjecting yourself to failure, you're giving yourself space to move forward and to engage in a process. This process-oriented language is really important in acknowledging accomplishments it's really important to acknowledge when you've met your goal and when you've met your vision. This is another kind of tool or sort of thing to practice, is to reframe compliments in a process-oriented way. So saying things like, I worked so hard to be able to hear my intonation better in this section, or I spent a lot of time being really thoughtful about how to map my bow in this passage. So by giving yourself a pat on the back for engaging in a process, you'll give yourself additional motivation to continue to work in that way. And also to acknowledge that the products of every day's practice session might not be perfectly ideal. Like, some practice days are just not good. And that's okay, because we're in that loop-de-doop-de process that we had the diagram of earlier. This one is really big, detaching your work from your self-worth. I'm really passionate about this topic as well. It took me a lot of years to get to this point, but when I truly realized that I have inherent worth regardless of how I play on any given day, it gave me the space to engage in these processes of listening and practicing in ways that added to my joy. So instead of using my playing as a way to prove my worth or to catch up to other people, music is now a tool for joy and for self-discovery in my own life. And I'll just add here that this took a lot of years of work with a professional therapist. So every person is different. I'm not here to recommend any specific therapy modalities or specialists. I'm just adding that reaching this point may require professional help for you or for your students, and that's okay. That's great that we have that as an option. So as a teacher, I think you can take the time to remind your students that no matter how well or poorly they play, their playing is not who they are. That takes us into my next point, which is about giving process-based compliments and avoiding character-based criticism. I think thankfully these teaching philosophies are on the way out, but for many generations, music teachers would use the fear of inadequacy as a way to encourage work and progression, supposedly. I'm a firm believer that this doesn't work. Well, it can work in having a really good player up on stage, but I believe that teachers have an important role in cultivating not only a student's musical health, but their emotional well-being as well. Whether it's a good thing or not, students look to their teachers for validation and approval. And the way that we give that validation as teachers can, I believe, encourage students to be more self-driven, happy practicers. So I had a teacher at a music festival that I went to when I was in my master's degree who told me that I was too lazy to fix my intonation. And that comment completely devastated me. I mean, thankfully I was an adult, so I knew myself well enough to know that I wasn't lazy. She was wrong about that. But she was right about the fact that my intonation was not at the highest level. So what do I do with those two pieces of information, right? What I wish she would have said to me instead was, you haven't put the time into listening to your playing in ways that will allow your intonation to improve. By giving a process-focused critique, it would have, one, shown me what I needed to do to improve this deficiency in my playing, which is to spend time listening to my playing in a new way. And two, it would have given me space to grow in my process rather than just capping my progress by giving me a character label like lazy. I understand that giving a comment like what I just described requires way more mental energy than just attaching a character label to a student. But I think it's a worthwhile effort for us to make in demonstrating to our students that they aren't just static snapshots of their current playing. They're fluid beings who are always in a state of learning and growing and developing. So this is something that I want to spend more time thinking about in my own playing and in my own teaching, is thinking about how can I give feedback to students in a way that is process-oriented. I think largely because I've seen it in my own being taught, I mostly know how to avoid character-based criticism, but I think it pairs really well with this process-oriented compliments, and that's something that I would love to spend more time thinking about for myself. So next slide. maybe let's just take a few comments because we're almost out of time, but any other thoughts that you have about how to encourage positive self-talk in your students?
Well, I just think showing them that you're excited about when they do things correct.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you are so good at that rhythm. Play that again. And did you hear, how you caught that on or caught on to that? And then they get this little boost of like, I am good at that rhythm.
Mhm.
And then they start to feel a little more excited. Maybe
Mhm.
they're playing with their progress. So if we're, giving them those positive comments, feedback, then they're going to be more likely to recognize that in themselves and then sort of take pride in,
Yeah.
I'm really good at rhythm, and maybe focus a little bit more when those future rhythms come up.
Yeah, and you're also modeling for them what it is to give positive feedback that they can then give to themselves in the practice room. So that's great. Yeah.
I thought pairing positive with the feedback. So for example, if a student is missing the staccatos in one part, but if you're like, but you got them here, you say, I love how you got these staccatos so snappy right here, so let's try to do that here.
Mhm.
So it's letting them know that like, you are capable and
Yeah,
you
yeah.
showed me here, but now.
Right. Let's just go a little further in that process that you've already engaged in to apply that here. That's great. Yeah.
I think we can do a lot by asking them guided questions.
Yeah.
What in your practice were you really proud of this week?
Mhm.
What did you work on that feels really good to you?
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah. Because then we're, giving them positive feedback on that process that they're engaging in. Yeah.
I've noticed a lot of times when I have a student first come to me, their common response to a mistake is always to say, oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
Maybe you experienced that too. And so in those cases, I have to actually stop the lesson and say, I am not sorry. I love this experience with you.
Mhm.
Don't feel like you have to be sorry. I'm not sorry. And I reassure them that it's not an offense to me and try to encourage them not to feel like they have to apologize
Mhm.
for everything they do wrong in class.
That's
A lot
wonderful.
of times if they do something wrong in the lesson, how we, as a teacher, when I explain it to at least, especially my older kids,
Mhm.
that if you don't make that mistake here, then how am I going to be able to give you any kind of suggestion that
Mhm.
makes different?
Mhm.
So this is the place where you want to make all your mistakes
Yes.
you possibly can make.
Yeah, and it sounds like this is a room full of incredible teachers who have established themselves as safe spaces for your students. Your students, it sounds like, know that they're with you to learn and to grow, so that's amazing. Great. Okay, so just in conclusion, a really brief wrap-up. Practice can be split into 3 stages: vision, diagnosis, and intervention. Being objective with yourself, particularly in that diagnosis stage, will help you understand what the gap is between what you want and where you are going. Myelin is our friend if we use it well in being mindful about the actions we take and the neural pathways we reinforce. And that includes the way that we reinforce neural pathways and how we talk to ourselves. That is another form of myelinating pathways to benefit us. Practicing being kind and objective towards yourself in the practice room will make your practice room a safer space that you are more inclined to want to spend time in. So, thank you so much for letting me join you today. It was a pleasure to talk about practicing. And I'm happy to stay after and answer any questions that anyone has. So, thank you for being here this morning.